Hello and welcome to this, the 13th lecture in our series for the Drought course. My name is Richard Byron Cox. I want to thank you for joining me today and thank you for taking this course. In this 13th lecture, we will focus on the approach or approaches that people, nations take to deal with the problem of drought. As you know, we have discussed what is drought. We have discussed issues as to where they take place. We have discussed how they impact on the society. But all of that is important only if we then use that to ensure that we take necessary actions to deal with drought. And this lecture, we're going to focus on some or one of the major approaches that people use in addressing drought. And before we do that, let us remind ourselves that regardless of where a drought takes place, there are common features. Features such as a shortage of water, features such as a rise in temperature, features such as a lack of water in the soil. That is common across the board. However, we must remember that wherever drought takes place is a specific place. St. Vincent, from where I'm from, is different from, say, Jamaica, or different from, say, Brazil. That's the first thing. And because it takes place in a specific space, it therefore means it affects specific people with a specific kind of culture. And so therefore, we know that all the approaches are not the same, and they cannot be the same. Now, one of the major approaches used across the globe, many countries use this, is called a three-pillar approach. Okay? And as its name suggests, there are three major pillars on which this approach stands. The first of them is something called monitoring, right? The situation, monitoring to ensure that we can see a drought approaching, so to speak. Second is identification of the risk and the vulnerabilities that comes because of a drought. And thirdly, of course, designing the necessary actions and measures to combat the drought, to deal with the drought. Now, let us deal with each of these from its own standpoint, each pillar by itself, so to speak. Let us first look at monitoring. What does this really involve when we say we are monitoring for drought? Well, what it actually involves is first and foremost observation. So we observe the vegetation, we observe the lack of moisture in the soil, we observe the absence of rainfall, we observe the fall of groundwater levels, we observe, for example, temperature loss, all of the temperature rise, all of these things are things that we observe, and when we observe them, we realize, hey, something is going wrong here, okay? The weather has changed, okay? The weather pattern has changed. And because of that, we can then say, so what is going to happen? And here comes the second part of this monitoring. We then start to think about forecasting. What are the possible consequences? Okay? For example, what are the consequences for agriculture? What are the consequences for health? We start to think of these things. But once we start to think of these things and we realize that a drought is going to take place, then there's one final important step for this pillar number one. And that is, we need to communicate this information to all concerned, to the relevant authorities, to the public at large. So that is pillar one, where we monitor, we observe what is happening. And because we observe what is happening, we then can say, okay, a drought is going to approach. So we now turn to pillar two. And this deals with identification of risk and vulnerabilities. What does that mean? Well, this involves us looking at the areas, the sectors of the society, of the economy, and so on, that could be affected by the drought. So, for example, food production. We know that we need water for food production. Once there's no rainfall and a drought steps in, food production would be affected. For example, if it's a country where the majority of the electricity is generated by hydropower, again, you're going to have a problem with your energy, okay? We also know that you cannot run a hospital, for example, without water. And so therefore, what we look at is that we try to identify the areas in the society, in the community, which are going to be affected by this. That's one. Now, outside of that, we go one step further. and we look at the communities that would be most affected, not everybody would be equally affected, in the same way, okay? And what kind of risks these people face. We have to look at all of that. So we think about prioritizing in terms of who would suffer most. And then we have to deal with estimations of what this is going to cost. Because to handle a drought, of course, costs money. It costs resources. And so you're thinking, we're going to have a drought, right? This thing is going to cost us how much? So that we can put the resources already in place to deal with the problem. But all of that, we still haven't finished the business yet. We must now deal with actually coming up with a plan, and that is pillar 3. We must design measures and actions as to how we're going to deal with this. And in designing those measures and action, we must think of very concrete steps and how we are going to implement them. So we have to think about steps in terms of, as I said before, prioritizing who are going to suffer most. We have to think about measures as to how we help these people. For example, save their livelihoods, protect their livelihoods. We have to think about measures as to how do we protect the ecosystem, biodiversity and so on and so forth. And therefore, what we're looking at here is designing plans to concretely address across the board, whether it is food production, whether it is the health system, whether it is the ecosystem. But we think of very concrete plans. We put those plans in place so that when the drought hits, we can implement them. Now, all of this is these 3 pillars are very, very important if you're going to have what is called more or less a cohesive approach to dealing with the drought. Why? Because once you have done that, you can make informed decisions, meaning that you're not guessing the issue so much because you have studied the problem, you know what the possibilities are in terms of the effects, and therefore you can make the right sort of, or more or less a more correct judgment as to what needs to be done. It helps to build trust between the people. It helps to create awareness and education. Why? Because you have all this information, you have communicated it. What you have done actually is do what? Cause public engagement into the question. Because remember, we always say drought is everybody's business, okay? And because of that public engagement, because of that education, because of that information, what have you achieved, or what can you achieve? Something called behavioral change. And that is what we seek to do. We want people to behave differently to drought, to see it for what it really is, everybody's problems. So with that, I close this lecture today, right? I just want to remind you that we are available should you have any difficulties or problem, and we would be grateful if you share this with others. Thank you very much. My name is Richard Barron Cox.